So without further ado, Sara's Chief Executive of Trafford Council, a role she took up in February 2019. She's a Mancunian, a planner by trade, and having studied at Manchester University, real local person. She's 30 years of local government experience, all with Greater Manchester councils. She's managed place-based programs, led operational services, delivered major capital projects, driven forward corporate and strategic policies and objectives, and operated locally, sub-regionally, regionally, and nationally. Sara is also lead chief executive in Greater Manchester for digital, as well as for taxis and private hire. She's a Manchester City fan, doesn't make you a bad person at all, and has a season ticket at the Etihad with her mum. Welcome, Sara, and if I hand over to you, I understand you have a presentation you'd like to share with us.
I wanted to talk to you today about the impacts of COVID-19. Probably wouldn't have expected, if I was going to talk to you, that we would have been talking in this way just 5 or 6 months ago. The world has changed almost beyond recognition, hasn't it? But I think the focus today around the impacts of COVID-19, the impact for our economy particularly, but also to get your perspective on what recovery looks like for Trafford and how we can work with you to make sure that we've got a recovery plan that's absolutely fit for purpose. So Lauren is on the call with me from the council, and she is going to share, I hope, the tech works. She's going to share the presentation now. Lauren, if you could do the honours, that's brilliant. Thank you. And I will press on that basis. So first slide, thank you very much. You will know, obviously, it has been all consuming, the pandemic over the last 4 months or so, with an impact for Trafford nationally and globally, for residents, for the economy, for business, for a whole range of public sector organisations, not least, of course, the NHS. And I think the speed with which the pandemic hit us probably took us by surprise. Certainly, I was one of many people in February, seeing it coming over the horizon and thinking that probably it would blow over. And actually, a few short weeks later, as you all very well know, we were in lockdown and in a crisis situation, I think, locally and nationally. 2 stages to a crisis. Those of you who know your emergency planning, immediate response, dealing with the here and now, but then also planning for how you recover from that crisis. And we're in both of those phases at the moment. We're still responding, very much so, but we have also started to think about how we can enable Trafford and its residents, its businesses, to bounce back from what has been a monumental shock. So next slide, please. I'm not going to talk you through all of the things on this slide. I think suffice to say, it just gives you a few indications of where we have seen some challenges, not least the inequalities of COVID. It doesn't impact communities all in the same way. Some are very disproportionately impacted. If you are Black, Asian, a minority ethnic community, in lots of cases, your health outcomes and your chances of dying, sadly, if you catch COVID-19, are significantly higher than the rest of the population. But also, and we're seeing it now, the impact disproportionately across our economy too. So some sectors, travel, hospitality, retail, leisure, there are others who have been really incredibly affected and will continue to be so. As well as, and we can't lose sight of this, our young people, those graduating, getting their A-levels and their GCSEs, those who've really lost out on several months of schooling and the ability actually to take their exams. So we have got some really significant concerns about the impact of this pandemic on our economy. Some parts of our economy have benefited, tech being one example, but many others haven't. You will have heard over the last 48 hours alone, 12,000 job losses announced, and some really big concerns about what happens as you come towards the end of the furlough period at the back end of October. Also, I'm stating the blind and the obvious, but I think we shouldn't underestimate it, not just the physical, but the mental health impact of COVID-19 on our communities too. Some positives, we cannot lose sight of that in amongst all of this. The the local community response, people, neighbours looking out for each other, has been like no other time. Certainly, I think we've all experienced that. And the leap that we have made, certainly some more than others, I speak for the council, we made an enormous leap to agile and flexible working at the end of March in the space of about 2 weeks. But also other parts of our economy, GPs doing their appointments online, hospitals holding outpatient consultations online. So some enormous changes, and I don't think we are going to go back in lots of cases to how it was before. Next slide, if you could. This, you probably, will send you this slide deck actually, so that you've got access to it. You probably can't see all of those things. This is the impact in numbers. We have a huge database and dashboard that gives us an idea every week of the impacts of COVID-19. So this is just a snapshot of things there. You may see there just shy of 200 people registered as having died as a result of COVID, and just shy of 900 cases in Trafford. You've probably heard over the last few days the whole issue about testing and information that local authorities have had access to, that tells them exactly how many cases are in their borough. That 884 is not a complete picture by any stretch of the imagination. There's some data that we have started to get access to now, which will show that increase. That's known as, for those of you who've listened, the Pillar 2 data, so national testing data, which we haven't had in the past. But what you will also see, so if you look at the graph with the dotted line on it and the red line there, that's the number of cases. So you can see absolutely that's Trafford, that we have got very much a flattening of that curve. So in the last week, we have had, and this is complete data now, in the last week, we've had 13, that's 13 cases, positive cases registered for Trafford as a whole. So certainly things are flattening out. We've also got a shielded population, as every place has, 6,300 people who have been identified as clinically extremely vulnerable, many of whom have needed our help, not been able to go out, not been able to get their shopping, not been able to collect prescriptions, actually isolated and lonely as well. I'll talk about that a little bit. We've had a community response line that we've set up. We've had over 10,000 calls to that line, and the bar chart in the middle with the horizontal bars on it shows for the last week what those calls have been about. And then in the bottom corner, we have paid out now over 3,500 grants to businesses since the start of the pandemic. About £43 million worth of grant has been paid out to Trafford businesses. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Next slide, please, if I could. So if that was response in numbers, this is response in images. I'm not going to talk about all of those things either. I would be here all day, but just to give you an indication of some of the things that we've had to do, and we've had to do at pace. Coordination and supply of personal protective equipment, PPE, has been a big challenge for us since the beginning of the pandemic with Manchester, because we've partnered up. We've supplied over 2 million pieces of PPE to people who have needed it. We've also worked with the hospitals to discharge people from hospital, to free up hospital beds. Many of those people have gone into care homes. That has obviously been a subject of enormous concern. One of the things that we did in Trafford, very early doors before lockdown actually, is we made a decision. It wasn't national, it wasn't expected at all, but we made a decision. We're one of only a few places that did decide that we were going to test everybody who came out of hospital and went into a care home so that we knew their COVID status. And what that actually means for Trafford is we have seen proportionately quite significantly less cases in our care homes than the national average. We've supported schools to open up, we've set up a temporary mortuary, sadly, and we've provided food awards and grant schemes and a whole variety of things that has been about supporting our local communities and businesses. Next slide, please. But as I said, response and recovery, we've probably spent the first 3 months with partners like the NHS, working hand in hand with them, focused on that emergency response. The last month, we started to raise our head above the parapet and think about what the impact of the pandemic has been for Trafford and actually how we work together with all the stakeholders in Trafford to get a really strong plan, to understand the impact and get a plan that's going to respond to that impact. So next slide, please. In lots of cases, we have been working with our other colleagues at the other 9 councils that make up Greater Manchester on a GM-wide response to recovery. We've worked with the local enterprise partnership as well as part of that, with a 3-stage approach to how we work as we see lockdown relaxing. What the government cannily calls shovel-ready sites is one aspect of that. So schemes that we can accelerate to start to get the economy moving. Getting an understanding of the labour market impact and skills is also another aspect. And then thinking about how we do our medium to long-term planning so that we do everything we can to create the right conditions to make sure that the recession that we are going to see is as V-shaped as it can be. There are certainly some who are suggesting that U-shaped. I don't know how many people are familiar with these. There's a W shape in and out of recession, and an L shape, which is absolutely where you don't want to be. So we've got to make sure that we make that recession as short as it possibly can be. And as part of a coordinated response, therefore, we've developed a campaign and a set of initiatives with GM that's called Build Back Better. It gives you an indication of what we've been focused on. So next slide, please. This gives you an idea of various areas that we have been working in and will be working in as we look ahead in respect of economic recovery. And it has got a few, I apologise, public sector acronyms. We're really good at those things, aren't we? I'll explain 1 or 2 of those in a minute. But the key for us is about making sure that we have enabled businesses to operate. Many businesses, some of you, will have continued operating throughout the lockdown period, that we support those who want to reopen now, to reopen safely with guidance and support, that we can support with investment and development, but also that we have our eye on the medium to long term as well to create those conditions. So we've been providing advice and guidance from the very outset. I've talked about some of the funding support that we've provided. We've also had a focus around a number of key sectors, hospitality being one, with a very notable date coming up in a few short days, which I'll talk about in a moment. Not underestimating as well the impact of our major sporting assets. So we have worked with Man United and Lancashire to make sure that both of the stadia can open safely for sport behind closed doors to be able to run. And as I speak, I am sitting opposite Old Trafford Cricket Ground, in which the West Indies cricket team are doing the last days of their isolation period before they head off to Southampton for the first test and then head back here for 2 further tests. And the importance of that can't be underestimated, because Old Trafford and Southampton have been able to host these tests. It has enabled English cricket to access £600 million of resource for TV rights, which will go into the sport and feed into grassroots. So dead important. Perhaps talk about the Trafford Centre in a moment. Some really shocking news Trafford Centre-wise, albeit I think anticipated over recent days, and our support for the centre as we move forward important, and making sure our town centres can thrive again, which takes us into the funding column. Some of those things in there, HIF is Housing Investment Fund, are about the resources that we can access to enable us to kickstart schemes, infrastructure, town centre schemes, regeneration schemes and housing, and making sure that we've got the right planning and strategic framework around those things. GMSF, you may well know that, is the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, but AAPs are Area Action Plans. So we've got an Area Action Plan around where I sit at the moment for the Civic Quarter. Area Action Plans are about a much more focused piece of work with stakeholders in a neighbourhood, with Wharfside being the next area that we're going to consider for a plan of that nature. That's the area surrounding the Old Trafford football ground. And also, I think, and not to forget, because it will be critical, the training and skills needs. Really, really clear as we emerge from this recession that we are going to see people with skills that become much less in demand, and we're going to see some really big pressures on skills, not least in tech and digital, as I've already mentioned, and how we enable that reskilling is going to be key. And then the red bar at the bottom, so important is this. We can't plan for this recovery sitting in the town hall not talking to people. Lord help us, we do that. We've got to understand how it feels for you and how we can make it work from a business perspective. Next slide, please. So I won't talk in lots of detail here. You will be aware, some of you may have access business grants that we've had available to us, a very significant national scheme in the first instance, and then in the bottom corner, a smaller scheme, a discretionary grant scheme, effectively developed so that some of those who weren't eligible for the scheme, the larger scheme, were able to access funding. We have in that fund about £2 million to spend. It's a complicated equation that means it isn't a set number, but it's about £2 million. We've only got 332,000 out of the door, but there's about another 100 applications that we're in the middle of processing, with more to come. But we are looking at whether we need to review the criteria there to see whether or not we can ensure, well, not to see whether or not, to give everybody assurance we spend every last penny of that £2 million supporting businesses in the borough. Next slide, please. Another one, and of particular relevance to us, given our hospitality sector and the number of town centres we've got and the importance of those town centres to our economy. And some support going in, and I know, having seen Angela is on the call, to support those out in our town centres to make sure that we can safely reopen our high streets. We've accessed we've been given an allocation of a comparatively small amount of funding to help with a range of things. And some of you may have been on our interactive website to give us ideas about the kinds of things we need to do, which could be everything from signage to marketing and PR to earmarking spaces outside to enable people to have pavement licenses, messaging on floors, a whole range of different things. I'm obviously happy to talk about that a little bit more. I'm sure it will be of relevance, but we can't underestimate the impact of COVID-19 on this sector in particular, and certainly Trafford branches of Debenhams, Warehouse, Oasis and Bright House have taken a real hit and have closed actually. Often those that were struggling have been tipped over the edge, unfortunately, as a result of COVID-19. And then last, I think, substantive slide seeks to, if you could, next slide, Lauren, is just to bring together what we've picked up to now in respect of the risks and issues that are emerging for Trafford, for businesses and for residents as well. And I won't go through all of those. I will absolutely share this slide deck. But suffice to say that even notwithstanding the support we've been able to put in, there are businesses who fall between the gaps that exist in some of the government support that's available. We are certainly, I think, expecting. Trafford actually is one of the, of Greater Manchester, one of the highest proportion of take-up of the furlough scheme. So potentially, if we think about furlough coming to an end as it gradually phases out to the end of October, a real sense nationally of people potentially hanging on to that furlough scheme, and then redundancies coming when we get to autumn and winter as well. So that is a real concern and a spy. And we have already seen a very significant increase actually in claimants of unemployment benefits, very significant indeed, 81% increase for Trafford. Recognising that we have the smallest numbers, so in number terms it's not the biggest increase in GM, but if you think nigh on a doubling, and it will certainly, I think, be a doubling year on year as we get into autumn, some huge challenges with some sectors, as I've said already, very disproportionately impacted. And being able to tackle those with partners and working with businesses is going to be absolutely essential for us. So, final slide from me. I am obviously happy to take questions about what you've heard, But I'm also here to ask you some questions as well, because as I say, I want to make sure that we work with all of the stakeholders to get ourselves a really robust recovery plan, and you helping us understand how we better engage with you as businesses, but also giving me a sense and your feedback about the impacts of COVID-19 would be really helpful in guiding us over the coming months and years, actually, because this isn't going to be a quick job. Thank you very much for listening, and over to you.